The tea had gone cold. I was sitting alone at the dining table, the candles flickering against the window, where frost traced delicate patterns I hadn't bothered to wipe clean. Thanksgiving. A day for family, laughter, warmth. Not this silence. I set my fork down beside the untouched slice of pumpkin pie. My daughter used to love it. She'd eat 2 before dinner even began. "Life's short, Mom," she'd say, grinning, her fingers sticky with whipped cream. That was years ago. 3 years now since I'd last seen Camila's face, heard her voice. 3 Thanksgivings without her. The doorbell rang. I froze. No one visits on Thanksgiving night. Not unless something is wrong. I wrapped my cardigan tighter and opened the door. A young woman stood there, bundled in a navy coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked maybe 25, familiar somehow. "Heh, are you Susan Bennett?" she asked, her voice gentle but uncertain. "I am." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small envelope. "I'm Janelle. Was Camila's best friend. She asked me to give you this. She wrote it a while ago. But I only found the courage to bring it now." She held out the envelope. I stared at it like it might burn me. The handwriting on the front was hers. I would know those slanted cursive letters anywhere. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Why now?" I whispered. "Because she's healing," Janelle said. "But not ready to come home." I nodded slowly. My fingers trembled as I took the letter. "Did she say what's inside?" I asked. Janelle shook her head. Only that it was the truth. I watched her walk down the snowy path, her figure fading into the dark. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in my hands. My throat felt tight. My heart too loud. I wanted to tear it open. I wanted to throw it in the fire. Instead, I placed it gently inside the old tin where I kept our tea bags. Hers was always chamomile. I poured myself a fresh cup. The steam rose slowly. I didn't drink it. I just sat there, staring at the tin, wondering if I'd been a good mother. Or just someone Camila survived. I didn't open the letter that night. But it was already tearing something open inside me. Have you ever lost someone without a goodbye? Where are you listening from tonight? The mornings were quiet now. Too quiet. I woke at 6, same as always, even though there was no job to rush to, no lunches to pack, no daughter stomping down the stairs with her headphones in. Just me. And the soft hum of the kettle. I sat by the window, watching the sky shift from slate gray to something softer. The tea tin sat beside me. Still sealed. 3 days had passed since Janelle handed me Camila's letter. I hadn't opened it. Not yet. But I kept it close. On the windowsill in the kitchen, inside the same floral tin where I used to hide the last of the chamomile bags so she wouldn't finish them all in 1 week. Funny, the things you hold on to. My house was clean. Almost obsessively so. The kind of clean you keep not because anyone's coming over, but because scrubbing helps you avoid thinking. Photos lined the mantel. Camila as a baby with cake on her cheeks, her 5th grade science fair ribbon, the high school prom picture where she wore that yellow dress and didn't smile. I told her yellow was too loud. She wore it anyway. I dusted around those photos every Sunday. Never moved them. Never added new ones. After she left, I stopped printing anything. No college graduation photo, no Christmas updates. Just silence. I tried calling once. Just once. The line rang out. No voicemail. No text. Just a dial tone colder than this Oregon winter. My sister Carol used to say, "Kids grow apart. It's part of life." But this didn't feel like growing apart. It felt like being cut out. I made soup that morning. Not because I was hungry, but because it gave my hands something to do. Carrots, celery, chicken. The same recipe Camila used to love. She'd dip her bread in the broth and say, "Mum, This tastes like hugs. I stirred slowly, remembering that. Then I reached for a second bowl. Instinct, old habit. I set it down, realized what I'd done. Laughed, then cried. Just like that. I wiped my face on my sleeve. Poured the second bowl back into the pot. There was no one coming. Not today. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. But the letter stayed in the kitchen. Waiting. Calling. And I was starting to wonder. Not what it said. But what I was so afraid to hear. She was 6 when she first asked if she could call me Mom. I remember the way she hesitated, clutching the corner of her blanket, her big brown eyes peeking out from behind it. Do I have to call you Susan forever? She asked. I nearly dropped the laundry basket. No, baby. You can call me whatever feels right. She tried. Mama. For a few weeks. Then settled into Mum, like it had always been there, like I had always been hers. And for a while, I believed I was. We had our little routines. Wednesday night lasagna, Sunday morning cartoons, her tiny footsteps running down the hallway after every nightmare. I taught her how to tie her shoes, how to say, thank you, and look people in the eye. I showed her how to write birthday cards properly. Full sentences, not just a heart and her name. I gave her everything I thought a child needed. Structure. Stability. Clean clothes, balanced meals, and a roof that never leaked. I worked double shifts. Skipped vacations. Said no to dating for years. People called me a saint. Said, that girl is lucky to have you. But luck isn't the same as love. And I didn't always know the difference. Camila was quiet as a child, thoughtful. She'd spend hours coloring on the back of receipts or old envelopes. Once, she drew a picture of the two of us in front of a big yellow house with a garden. I want to live somewhere like this when I grow up, she said. I told her, you should focus on college. Gardens can wait. She nodded. Folded the drawing in half. Tucked it into her notebook. Years later, I found it crumpled in her closet during spring cleaning. I smoothed it out, taped it to the fridge. She never mentioned it again. Looking back, I wonder how many small pieces of her I dismissed. Thinking I was helping, thinking I knew better. When she was 12, she wanted to audition for a school play. I told her it would interfere with homework. That grades came first. Always. She didn't argue. Camila rarely did. She just stopped bringing things up after a while. By the time she hit high school, she was polite, present, but distant. Like someone visiting a house she didn't fully live in. And I kept telling myself everything was fine. That teenagers were like that. That love meant rules. That gratitude would come later. But now, as I stood in that clean kitchen, watching the soup go cold, I wasn't so sure. Maybe the letter in that tin held more than truth. Maybe it held a version of Camila I never let bloom. I don't remember the last time we laughed together. Not really. Not the polite kind over a movie or something on TV. I mean the real kind. When your eyes close and your stomach hurts, because something silly just cracked open joy inside you. I think it was during her first year of college. She came home for winter break. We baked cookies. The timer got stuck, and the whole kitchen smelled like cinnamon and smoke. We laughed so hard we forgot to be mad. That memory lives in a drawer somewhere, folded between the ones where she barely spoke, ate dinner quietly, and disappeared back into her room. She started working part-time at a bookstore downtown. Art books, mostly. She brought one home once. Laid it on the table. Thought you might like this one, she said. I barely looked at it. Told her, you shouldn't be wasting money when you've got student loans. She never brought another. After college, she got an offer in Chicago. Good company. Benefits. Far. I tried to be happy for her. I really did. But I couldn't stop myself. You know I did everything for you? I told her the night she packed. Everything. You wouldn't be here without me. She didn't respond. She just zipped her suitcase, put on that olive coat I always thought made her look tired, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back, said, "Thank you for raising me, Mom. But sometimes love that comes with receipts isn't love." And then she was gone. No hug. No slammed door. Just quiet. The kind that lives in the walls. I didn't open her room for 6 months. When I finally did, it looked exactly the same, except for the empty frame on the nightstand. The one that used to hold our picture at her middle school graduation. She took the photo. Left the frame. Tonight, I stood in that doorway again. 3 years later, the room smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. On the edge of her bed, folded neatly, was the gray knitted scarf I bought her in high school. It still had a tiny thread she never clipped. The one she used to pull at when she was nervous. I picked it up, held it to my face, and for a moment I thought I smelled her again. Without thinking, I walked to the kitchen. Opened the tea tin. The envelope was still there. Still sealed. But this time I placed my hand on it. Not to open it. Just to touch. And something inside me softened. The first real sign didn't come in a loud argument. It came in silence. It was the week after Camila's college graduation. We'd gone out for dinner. Her choice, a quiet little Italian place with string lights and soft jazz playing in the background. She barely touched her ravioli. I remember asking, "Is something wrong?" She smiled politely. "No, just tired. Long week." But her eyes said otherwise. Tired wasn't the right word. They looked disappointed. Not in me. Not in the food. But in something she couldn't. Or wouldn't. Name. I asked if she'd thought about what came next. "Maybe you could find something here in Bend," I said, careful. "Start small. Get settled. Build a life near home." She stirred her drink. "I've been applying in Chicago." I felt something shift in my chest, but I didn't show it. Instead, I said, "That's far." "I know." That was all she said. The next week, I noticed she'd cleared her browser history from the shared desktop. Camila was always careful. About space, about privacy. But never secretive. Until then. Later that night, I passed by her room. The door was ajar. She was packing. Not in the usual way, not the "just in case" kind, but the "I'm leaving and I'm not sure I'll come back" kind. She didn't see me. She was folding a hoodie I hadn't seen before. It had a bookstore logo on the front. Not one from Bend. I stepped back. Didn't say anything. But something inside me twisted. A knot I couldn't untangle. Was I losing her? Or had I already lost her, bit by bit? In every moment I told her how to live, instead of asking her what she wanted. A few days later, she asked if I still had the birth certificate we received when the adoption finalized. Said she needed it for paperwork. She didn't explain what paperwork. I found it in the filing cabinet under C. Right behind car maintenance and charity receipts. It felt strange. How her name was filed next to everything else I thought I'd done right. She took the paper and held it like it weighed more than a single page should. Said, "Thank you." Then walked away. No follow-up. No explanation. Just quiet. That's when I first wondered if I'd become a chapter she was learning how to close. A week after she left for Chicago, her Instagram account went private. It wasn't the kind of private you set for safety. It was the kind that told you were no longer part of the circle. I stared at the message. "This account is private. Follow to see their photos." We were already connected. Or we used to be. I tried not to overthink it. Told myself maybe she was cleaning up, starting fresh, making room for adult life. But the H settled deep. I opened my laptop that night, wrote her a short email. No lecture, no guilt. Just, hope you're settling in okay. Let me know if you need anything. Love you, Mom. I never got a reply. Not that night, not the next week, not ever. A month passed. Then too, I sent another message. This time, a photo of our dog from years ago, curled up by the fire. He passed when Camila was in high school. She cried for 3 days. I thought the memory might soften her. No response. Only silence, the kind that echoes. I scrolled through old voicemails, listening for her laugh. I played them on low volume while I folded laundry. Her voice, once familiar, started sounding like someone I used to know. That winter, I cooked her favorite chicken pot pie. Set 2 plates, then packed the second one into a container and left it in the fridge. Just in case. The days blurred into one another. Work ended early. Friends stopped asking about her. Even Carol, my sister, said, maybe give her space. She'll come around. But space wasn't what hurt. It was absence. The choice to disappear. And it wasn't sudden. I saw that clearly now. Camila had been pulling away in inches, not steps. I remembered our last dinner together. She sat across from me, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I asked if she liked the job. She nodded. I asked if she needed anything. She shook her head. I asked if she missed home. She didn't answer. She reached for her glass of water, drank half, then whispered, I think I'm doing okay. It was the saddest sentence I'd ever heard, not because it sounded unsure, but because it didn't include me. That night, she left early. Said she had an early shift. She didn't hug me goodbye. Just put on her coat, stepped out the door, and vanished into the cold. The wind howled. But she didn't look back. I told myself I hadn't seen the signs. But that wasn't true. I saw them. I just didn't want them to mean what they meant. I thought if I kept the house warm, kept the pantry stocked, kept the check-ins casual and clean, she'd stay. I didn't yell. Didn't accuse. Didn't press when she gave short answers. I told myself that was respect. That was giving her space. That was what good mothers did. But deep down, it wasn't kindness. It was fear. I was afraid if I asked too many questions, she'd give me the real answers. And I wasn't ready for them. The truth was, Camila hadn't been mine in a long time. Maybe she never truly had been. Maybe I just loved the version of her that made sense to me. Obedient, grateful, shaped, not wild or uncertain or drifting. Not a daughter who questioned the rules I lived by. I stood in her old room again that evening, the scarf still draped over my shoulder. A draft slipped through the window frame, lifting the edge of a photo on her dresser. It was one I hadn't seen in years. Camila at 16, holding a paintbrush, her cheeks smudged with color. Eyes glowing. I remember that day. She'd been part of a community mural downtown. Spent a week on it after school. I'd shown up the last day. Told her it was beautiful. But warned her not to let art distract her from math. She didn't speak for the rest of the ride home. That photo. I'd stuffed it in a drawer back then. Said it wasn't framed properly. But now, I could see it for what it really was, a piece of her I didn't know how to love. So I ignored it, and she learned to hide. I placed the photo back down, brushed my thumb across the edge, whispered, I'm sorry. Then I walked downstairs, lit a candle, and stood by the kitchen counter, facing the tin. This time, I didn't just touch the envelope. I picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should. As if it had absorbed every word she couldn't say. I held it close to my chest, closed my eyes, and breathed in. Still sealed, still waiting, but maybe I wasn't. Not anymore. If you saw every sign and still did nothing, was it too late to make it right? I didn't open the letter right away. Even after I picked it up. even after I held it to my chest like a memory I'd forgotten how to carry. But that night, as the wind scraped against the windows and the heat hissed from the old vents, I sat down at the kitchen table and peeled the envelope open. Slowly, like it might bleed. The paper inside was soft, creased in the corners, with handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Still neat, still hers. I took a breath. And read, "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, then I guess Janelle did what I couldn't. Talk to you." I paused. Already, I felt it. The gap. The ache in between those simple lines. She had written this knowing I might never read it. I'm not writing to hurt you. I'm writing because silence has been hurting me. I know you raised me with everything you had. I know you sacrificed. I know you worked double shifts, gave up dating, skipped vacations. Everyone reminded me how lucky I was, so I believed them. I said thank you. I got good grades. I kept quiet. I tried to be what you needed me to be. I stopped there. Let the words sit. Let the truth press down. She wasn't angry. She was honest. A different kind of pain. I kept reading. But being grateful doesn't mean I didn't feel lonely. Being provided for doesn't mean I felt seen. And loving someone doesn't mean they know who you are. The words were like glass, clear but sharp. You told me I was your daughter. But some days, I felt more like your resume. I felt something snap in my chest. I closed the letter for a moment. Just a moment. Let my hand rest on the edge of the paper, like it might hold me steady. I looked around the kitchen. The spotless counters, the calendar still turned to last month, the empty second chair across from me. Camila had sat there hundreds of times. Eating, thinking, hiding. How had I missed it? Or worse, how had I seen it and pretended not to? I opened the letter again. The ink blurred slightly under my breath. I didn't leave because I hated you, Mom. I left because I couldn't breathe. There was always this weight in the air between us. A quiet expectation. Be good. Be thankful. Be everything you're supposed to be. Because someone gave you a chance. I didn't know how to disappoint you without feeling like I'd betrayed you. I sat back in the chair, hands trembling. The letter rustled in my grip. I remembered the first time she came home with a C on her math quiz. She was 10. Eyes red. Hands clenched. I didn't yell. Didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "You can do better. You owe it to yourself. And to me." She didn't cry in front of me. She went to her room. I found her later that night asleep at her desk, flashcards scattered around her head like fallen leaves. I told myself I was motivating her, setting standards, teaching her discipline. But now I wondered if I'd taught her something else. That love comes with conditions. That affection is performance-based. That gratitude means never having a bad day. I looked down at the next part of her letter. Mom, I know you thought you were giving me everything. But sometimes, what I needed most was permission to just be human. I wanted to be able to cry without hearing, "At least you're not on the streets." I wanted to mess up without feeling like I'd ruined your sacrifice. I wanted to say I was tired without being told how tired you were. I covered my mouth with my hand. She wasn't wrong. I had said those things, not out of cruelty, but from exhaustion, from fear, from believing that reminding her of how hard I worked would make her try harder. Be stronger. Be what? A better version of me. I closed my eyes. All those times she came home quiet, and I thought it was hormones, or mood swings, or just that age. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the sound of her spirit curling inward. Learning how to hide where it felt safest. I thought about the birthday when she turned 15. She asked for art supplies. I bought her a calculator. "You'll thank me later?" I said, handing it over with a proud smile. She smiled back. A small, tight smile. The kind you wear when you're trying not to show you've just been pushed a little further away. Back then, I thought she was just being moody. Now, I wasn't so sure. Do you remember the night it rained so hard the roads flooded? I was 17. You picked me up from school late. The parking lot was nearly empty, and I was sitting on the curb, soaked, my shoes squishing with every step. You handed me a towel. I didn't speak. We drove home in silence. I cried in the car. You kept your eyes on the road, never asked why. I felt the breath leave my body. I remembered that night, clear as day now. I was late, because of a client meeting. I had just closed out a finance report, and my mind was still on spreadsheets and deadlines. When I saw her, drenched and quiet, I told myself, she's strong. She'll shake it off. But I'd seen her tears in the rearview mirror. She wasn't hiding them. She was hoping I'd notice. And I didn't. I'd turned up the radio, talked about dinner, said something like, "At least you'll get a hot shower." And now here it was, in ink, after all these years. That was the night I realized some silences weren't safe. They were just invisible walls you taught me to build. I'm not writing this to punish you, Mom. I'm writing because for the first time, I'm learning how to be a whole person, without needing to shrink to make space for someone else's version of me. I love you. I do, but I had to choose myself. Finally, Camila, the last word sat there like a stone. No. Love always? No. Yours. Just her name. Full stop. I folded the letter carefully. Not neatly. Just carefully, like something sacred that had been broken, but not discarded. Then I sat in the dark. Not because I didn't want light, but because I didn't deserve it just yet. That letter didn't shatter me. It undressed me, and beneath the layers of motherhood, sacrifice, and structure was someone who never learned how to ask, "Are you okay?" Not as a mother, but as a woman, to her daughter. And maybe that was where it all cracked first. I always thought silence protected us, but maybe it was the loudest thing she ever heard from me. The letter didn't leave me angry. It left me empty. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a shadow I didn't recognize. Folded towels. Wiped counters. Stared too long at boiling water. I didn't know what to do with the truth. It didn't scream. It whispered. And somehow, that was worse. One afternoon, I opened my laptop. Not to write. Just habit. I clicked into a browser and typed her name. Out of instinct. Or longing. I don't know which. Her profile was still private. But her name came up, on a local art gallery page in Chicago. Featured young talent. Camila Bennett. The headline made my throat close. There was a photo. She stood between two large canvases, smiling. Radiant. Wearing the same olive coat I'd once said made her look tired. But in that photo, she didn't look tired at all. She looked free. There was a quote beneath it. For a long time, I made myself small to fit inside someone else's idea of love. My name wasn't there, not even once. She dropped, "Susan," years ago. But seeing it absent in print, in something she'd built, claimed, owned, felt like a final erasure. I clicked through the gallery's event page. A short video played. Camila stood at a mic, thanking the crowd. I dedicate this piece to the women who raised me to survive, even when they didn't know how to love out loud. A few people clapped. Some even stood. I sat in my kitchen chair, watching it on a tiny screen, feeling like the world had moved on without me. She said, "The women." Plural. Not my mom. Not Susan. Just the women. I wasn't even a title anymore. I didn't turn off the video. I just closed the laptop. Then I sat there, still in my robe, soup gone cold on the stove, sunlight slipping past the blinds like it didn't want to be here either. A knock came at the door. 3 soft taps. Then silence. I didn't move, but it came again. I pulled myself up, legs heavy, heart heavier. It was Carol. She stood on the porch with a bag of groceries, and a face that knew everything without asking. "I thought you might have forgotten to eat again," she said. "Can I come in?" I nodded. She unpacked celery, ginger ale, a rotisserie chicken. No small talk. Just quiet, the kind you grow into when you've been sisters long enough. Finally, she sat across from me. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," I whispered. She didn't ask why. She already knew. I pushed the letter toward her. "Camila wrote me?" Carol scanned the pages, eyes narrowing, lips tightening, but she didn't say much. When she finished, she folded it slowly, placed it back on the table. "She was brave to write that," Carol said. "And you were brave to read it." I let out a bitter laugh. Brave. I feel like I just watched her bury the version of me she never needed. Carol tilted her head. "She didn't bury you, Susan. She just stopped editing herself to make you comfortable." That stung. More than I wanted it to. "But I gave her everything," I said. "I built her life with my hands. And now she calls me one of the women. Like I'm a shadow in her footnote." Carol leaned forward, gently, like she was laying down a final card in a game no one wanted to win. "You weren't a shadow," she said. "But you weren't a mirror either. You never let her reflect her own light back at you. You were always holding up your own." I blinked fast, but the tears came anyway. "She used to call me Mom. And she meant it," Carol said. "But names only last if the love behind them can breathe." She stood, walked to the sink, poured us both a glass of water. Then she placed her hand on my shoulder. "She's not the only one who needs healing, Sue." I swallowed hard, and for the first time since the letter, I felt my chest open. Not with peace, but with release. If you're no longer, Mum, in someone's life, does that mean you failed? Or finally gave them space to become themselves? The next morning, I opened the tea tin again. The letter was still there, creased from being read too many times in too little light. But this time, I wasn't looking for pain. I was looking for direction. I laid it on the table, alongside the folded envelope it came in. There was a faint scent, old paper, lavender, and something like almond oil. Camila always wore that. Back when we still hugged. I pulled out the small notepad from the drawer beside the fridge. The one we used to write grocery lists on. I turned to a clean page and wrote, "Janelle, this is Susan. I read her letter. I need to talk to someone who knew her after me." I stared at it for a full minute. Then I tore the page, folded it twice, and tucked it in an envelope. I didn't have Janelle's address. But she'd left a business card. It was still on the fridge, pinned by a sunflower magnet. Janelle Torres, Visual Arts Department. Lincoln Middle School, Chicago. I sent the note. No return request. No expectation. Just sent it. That same afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into Camila's room with a notebook. Not to clean. Not to pack. But to remember. The room had settled into silence. The kind that doesn't echo, just lingers. Her bookshelf was still full. Frida Kahlo, Zadie Smith, a dog-eared volume of Rilke. I pulled one out. A thin poetry journal tucked between pages. Inside, Camila's handwriting looped delicately across the margins. No one taught me how to live with tenderness. Only how to survive through performance. I sat on the floor, that sentence heavy in my lap. It wasn't a complaint. It was a diagnosis. Of both of us, I spent so long teaching her to be strong, that I never gave her permission to be soft. To break. To cry. To say no. To me. I closed the book and whispered, "I didn't know how to be soft either, kiddo." And somehow, Saying it out loud in that quiet room made me feel like I had finally started answering a question Camila never dared ask. 3 days later, the package arrived, small, wrapped in brown paper, the kind you tear with a single pull. No letter, no note. Just a return address: J. Torres, Lincoln Middle School, Chicago. I sat on the living room rug to open it. Somehow, the couch felt too formal. Inside were 4 items, each wrapped in thin tissue paper, each weightless, yet heavy. The first was a keychain. A tiny enamel book with the words, "I contain multitudes." Walt Whitman. She must have bought it for herself. Camila loved language. She just never used it for herself when she was with me. She was always editing. Always shrinking. Maybe this was her way of saying, I was always more than you saw. The second item was a photograph. A Polaroid. Slightly faded. Camila in a room filled with paint splatters and sunlight. She was barefoot, holding a cup of coffee, laughing at something outside the frame. Her laugh looked free, unfiltered, like it hadn't passed through someone else's expectations first. I stared at that photo until the edges felt warm in my fingers. The third item, a paintbrush. Old. Well, used? The handle was worn where her thumb would rest. I remembered once telling her, "Art's a nice hobby, but not a job. You can't live off colors." And yet here it was. Proof that she had. Not just lived, but created. Persisted. Despite me. Maybe even because of me. I placed the brush down gently, like an apology I didn't know how to word. The last item was unexpected. A receipt. From a second-hand bookstore. The note scrawled at the bottom in pencil. For Mom, if she ever wants to read what I couldn't say. Below that, the title, "The Body Keeps the Score." I felt my breath catch. I knew that book. Heard about it on some podcast once. Something about trauma. How the body remembers what the mind buries. I stared at that receipt longer than anything else. Long enough that the tears came. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Like rain on a roof you don't realize is leaking until your socks are wet. She had tried. Even from a distance, she was still offering pieces of herself. Softly. Quietly. As if saying, I'm still reachable. But you'll have to come to me different than before. The next morning, I walked downtown. It wasn't warm. Oregon in late November rarely is. But I didn't drive. I needed the cold air. I needed the walk. The local bookstore was still there, tucked between a consignment shop and a bakery that always smelled like burnt sugar. Inside, it was quiet. Warm light. Soft jazz. Books stacked high like walls made of memory. I found the title easily. The Body Keeps the Score. Blue cover. Heavy. Not just in weight. I bought it without hesitation. Didn't wait for a sale. Didn't check the reviews. Didn't overthink. That night, I made chamomile tea, not out of habit, but out of softness, for her, and maybe for me. I read the introduction. Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. I underlined that sentence. Then I sat in silence, letting it echo. I had always believed that survival was enough, that if I could raise a girl to be strong, independent, unbreakable, I had done my job. But strength without safety is a shell, and love without room to be soft is a contract. Not a home. I didn't finish the book that night. Just read until my eyes blurred, then I pulled out a new sheet of paper and began writing. Not a reply. Not a defense. Just truth. Camila, I read your letter. I read it more than once. It didn't break me. It opened me. That may not mean much now. But I want you to know. I see you clearer today than I ever have. Not because of your silence, but because I finally stopped talking. I used to think being a mother meant shaping you. Now, I think it meant holding space while you shaped yourself. If that makes me late, I'm sorry. If that makes me small in your story, I still thank you for letting me be a part of it. I signed it, folded it, and slid it into an envelope, but I didn't mail it. Not yet. Instead, I placed it next to the photo of us at her 8th birthday. The one where she had frosting on her nose, and I was mid-laugh, before everything got so quiet. I wasn't ready to send the letter. But for the first time, I wasn't writing to fix the past. I was writing to meet her in the present. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address this time. Just my name, typed neatly, as if someone didn't want their handwriting to give too much away. Inside, a single folded card. Dear Susan, Camila's gallery show is this Saturday. She doesn't know I'm sending this, but I thought you'd want to know, just in case. It's open to the public. You don't need an invitation. Just the choice to come. No pressure, no expectation, but maybe a window. Warmly, Janelle. I stared at the card. Let the words settle. I read it again. And then again. My first thought wasn't excitement. It was panic. What if she sees me and walks out? What if she thinks I'm crossing a boundary she carved carefully? What if I ruin everything just by being in the room? But then another voice, quieter, softer, whispered something else. What if this is the moment she sees you trying, not fixing? I left the card on the kitchen counter. Made tea. Didn't drink it. I just paced. The house felt too small for the weight in my chest. That night, I dreamed of Camila. She was standing in a room full of light. Paintings covered every inch of the walls. Some abstract, some vivid. One looked just like our backyard, the magnolia tree from when she was 6. In the dream, she didn't see me. But I saw her, laughing, alive, and I woke up crying. Not because she was gone, but because in the dream, she belonged to herself. And that was the version I had never let her be in real life. The next morning, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the suitcase I hadn't used in years. It was covered in a thin film of dust, its handle stiff from time, like it wasn't used to being moved anymore. Neither was I. I hesitated. I hadn't booked a ticket yet. Hadn't told Carol. Hadn't even admitted out loud that I was considering going. But my hands moved anyway. I opened the suitcase, laid it on the floor, and started with the easiest thing, a sweater. Then another. Then the framed photo from Camila's 8th birthday. The one I'd placed beside the letter. I didn't wrap it. Didn't cushion it in clothes. Just placed it face up. Let it look at everything else I added. Next, the scarf. Still soft. Still frayed at the edge. I folded it carefully. Pressed it against my chest before tucking it in. I paused at the envelope. The letter I'd written but hadn't mailed. I held it in my palm for a long time. Not sure if I was carrying it to give, or just to remember how it felt to say something honest, with no guarantees. I packed it anyway. The last thing I added was a small sketchbook Camila made when she was 13. I found it in the back of her closet 2 weeks ago. Most pages were filled with small doodles. Cats, clouds, random shapes. But on the last page, she'd written in block letters, "One day, I'll make something big enough to hold all the parts of me." I closed the sketchbook and slid it between layers of cotton and wool, then zipped the suitcase shut. My hand hovered over the phone for almost an hour. Google flights. Oregon to Chicago. 3 seats left on the Friday evening flight. My finger trembled as I tapped. Purchase. It was done. I wasn't going to show up and demand anything. I wasn't going to beg or explain. I just wanted to be in the room. To see her world. Not from the edge of memory, but from where she stood now. Even if she didn't see me. Even if she asked me to leave. Even if my heart shattered a little more in the process. Because maybe, just maybe, showing up without expectations was the beginning of a different kind of love. The gallery was tucked between a bakery and a florist on a narrow street near downtown Chicago. Saturday dusk made everything golden, but my hands were cold. I stood across the street for 10 minutes before stepping inside. The space smelled faintly of varnish and coffee. People moved quietly, some in pairs, some alone. All of them looking up. At color, at canvas, at pieces of someone I once thought I knew completely. I didn't see her at first, and maybe that was better. I took slow steps through the exhibit. Each painting had a small card. Title, medium, year, but it wasn't the details that caught me. It was the shapes, the tension, the space she left empty on purpose. One canvas stopped me. It was mostly gray, but with a single burst of yellow in the bottom corner. A ribbon of color barely stretching upward. The card beside it read, Threads 2011-2023. Underneath a quote, "There are ties we cut for our own breath. But sometimes, we leave a piece hanging, just in case." I felt my knees weaken. I gripped the strap of my purse. My breath caught, because I knew that yellow, it was the same shade as the frosting from her 8th birthday cake. The one she smeared on my nose when I leaned in for a picture. The same picture I'd packed in my suitcase. I looked up again at the canvas, at that yellow reaching, barely, but clearly, toward the center, and I knew. Even if she didn't know I was here, even if she didn't want to, I was still a thread, a piece, not the whole. But not gone. I turned slowly, planning to leave. No need to stay long, no need to risk more than presence. And that's when I saw her. Across the room, near a window. Talking to someone. She looked different. Older. Not in age, in knowing. Her laugh reached me in waves. For a second, I let myself wonder what would happen if she turned. If her eyes met mine. But she didn't. Not then. Instead, I walked past the last painting. It was titled simply, Inheritance. A chair. A scarf on the back. A woman's hands resting on a table. No face, just hands, gently folded, and on the table a white envelope. I knew those hands. Knew that scarf. Knew that table. She hadn't erased me. She had placed me, quietly, intentionally, inside her story. She never turned. But she didn't need to. I was already seen. In paint, in silence, in the space she made for me without asking permission. I was almost out the door when I heard her voice. Mom. It wasn't loud. Not sharp. Not laced with anger. Just quiet. Like the hallway of a childhood home. Like the word itself didn't know where it stood anymore. I turned slowly. Camila stood a few feet behind me, her arms crossed loosely, her head tilted. She wasn't surprised. Not really. Her expression wasn't one of betrayal. It was something softer. Resigned. Curious. Cautious. I opened my mouth, but she lifted a hand gently, not to stop me. Just to slow everything down. "Before you say anything," she said, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. She glanced past me, toward the painting titled, Inheritance. Then back at me. "Are you here for me? Or are you here to feel like a mother again?" I didn't answer right away. Because I didn't know. At least not in the way I would have, years ago. Back then, I'd have said, "Of course it's for you. I'm your mother. This is love." But that answer didn't fit anymore. Not in this version of her. Not in this version of me. So I took a breath. And told the truth. "I think I'm here to let go of needing to be anything. Except someone who's willing to see you now. Fully. Honestly. Even if I'm no longer part of the picture." Her shoulders relaxed. Barely. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "That's okay," I replied. "I didn't come to do anything to you. Just to witness. To be present, not persuasive." She looked down. Her thumb brushing the inside of her wrist. A nervous habit she'd had since she was little. One I hadn't seen in years. I noticed you near the painting, she said. You knew, didn't you? I nodded. That scarf, that table, that letter on the canvas. I paused. My hands. Camila's eyes shimmered. Just a little. I didn't paint it to make you feel guilty, she said quietly. I painted it to remind myself I come from something. Even if it wasn't always soft. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just walked. Camila grabbed her coat from the back room. I waited by the door. She nodded once, barely, toward the street. So we walked. The night air in Chicago was brisk, but it wasn't cruel. The wind danced around our ankles like it didn't want to interrupt. Just witness. We passed a busker playing something slow on an acoustic guitar. Neither of us commented, but I saw Camila tap one finger softly against her coat pocket. The rhythm lived in her. Even if she didn't share it with me. At the corner, she turned into a quiet cafe. I followed. There were only 3 people inside. 2 students and the barista. The lights were dim, the windows fogged at the corners. She pointed to a booth in the back. I slid in across from her. She didn't order. Neither did I. For a while, we just sat. Her eyes wandered. Mine stayed. Then, finally, a whisper of a question. Did you read it more than once? I blinked. Yes, I said. Every word. She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the tabletop. She traced an invisible line along the wood grain. And did you want to explain anything? I exhaled. No, I said. I wanted to. At first. But the more I read, the less I needed to defend myself. Her fingers stopped moving. That meant something. I didn't write it to hurt you, she said after a moment. I know, I replied. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was heavy, yes, but like a weighted blanket, like something meant to hold you in place until you're ready to move. She looked at me then. Really looked. I don't know where this goes, she admitted. I'm okay with that, I said. And I was. For the first time in years, I didn't need to know. I didn't need a plan. A next step. A schedule of repair. I just needed this. Her voice. Her presence. Her honesty. That was more intimacy than we'd had in a decade. The cafe door jingled when we stepped out. Camila pulled her scarf tighter. I adjusted mine, the one she left behind years ago. She noticed. Didn't say anything, but I saw the way her eyes flickered. Recognition, not regret. The street was quieter now. Fewer cars. Fewer words between us. But not all silences are empty. She glanced at her phone, slipped it back into her coat. I should get going, she said, almost apologetically. I nodded. Of course. We stood there for a moment, 2 shadows cast by streetlight, one reaching, one returning. She looked up at me, then past me. Like she was measuring what this all meant, what to carry, what to leave. Then, softly, like a leaf brushing pavement, maybe next time, you order the tea. I smiled. It wasn't wide, wasn't bright. But it was real. I'll be ready, I said. She leaned in just slightly, not a hug, not a goodbye. Just proximity, the kind that says, you're not all the way out. Then she turned, walked down the sidewalk. 1 step at a time. No looking back. But not rushing either. I stayed there. Watched her go. Let the wind move through the space where she once stood. I didn't cry. I didn't cling. I just breathed, and for the first time in years, the breath didn't catch halfway up my throat. It filled me. Steady. Whole. Because maybe forgiveness doesn't arrive in grand gestures. Maybe it walks beside you for a block, says one line, and leaves the door unlocked. She didn't say, I forgive you. She didn't need to. Sometimes, healing is the seat across from you that stays empty, but not closed. I came back to Oregon 3 days later. The house was cold when I entered. The kind of stillness that doesn't welcome or reject. Just waits. I left my suitcase by the door, walked into the kitchen, turned on the kettle. Routine has a way of reminding you who you are, especially when no one else is watching. The steam curled upward. I watched it dance, then disappear. Just like grief. Just like hope. That night, I didn't unpack. I didn't call anyone. I just sat on the porch with a blanket, listening to the wind rustle the cedar trees behind the house, and I whispered to the dark. She saw me. Not all of me, not yet. But enough. I began small. Cut back the roses. Cleaned out the attic. Donated the old boxes of what used to be. I started a journal. Not the kind where you beg for answers. Just 1 page a day. 3 lines. What I noticed. What I felt. What I chose to carry forward. Some days the page stayed blank. Other days it bled. But I never skipped. Not once. One Saturday, I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. There were 7 of us. All women, all quiet. We painted fruit the first day. Mine looked more like bruised hearts than peaches, but I didn't care. I was creating something that didn't need to be forgiven. 2 months passed. Then 3. I didn't call Camila. She didn't call me. But on a rainy Thursday, I opened my mailbox to find a postcard. No return address. Just a painting. A cafe table, 2 chairs. 1 cup of tea. The handwriting was unmistakable. You ordered it after all. No signature. She didn't have to. I pressed the card to my chest and let myself weep. Not from sorrow, but from the strange relief of being remembered without being summoned. Sometimes when people say legacy, they think of buildings, children, photos in frames. But mine is this: I kept the door open, even when it stayed shut. I stopped knocking, and I started living in the house I built for myself, not just standing at the threshold, waiting for someone else to let me in. Justice can be quiet, but healing. Sometimes it's a cup of tea at an empty table. Still warm, still waiting. Where are you listening from? Have you ever forgiven someone without needing them to say sorry? Share your story below. You're not alone. Spring arrived in Oregon like a quiet apology. The trees outside my window bloomed in soft pinks and hesitant greens. Everything felt new, not loud, just honest. That morning I opened my closet and saw it again. The scarf. Soft gray with edges hand-stitched in blue. Camila had picked it out for me when she was 12. A Mother's Day gift. Back when things were still light, I'd worn it to every parent-teacher meeting, every winter concert. And then, eventually, not at all. It became a symbol of guilt, of absence. But after Chicago, it became something else. Closure, maybe. Not dramatic, not final. Just done. I folded it carefully, placed it in a simple box, lined with tissue. No note, no explanation, just the scarf. I walked it to the post office on 4th Street, gave the clerk the address to the gallery where she worked. Not her apartment, not her studio. A middle place. Neutral ground. The woman behind the counter looked at the box, then at me. Want to add a card? I smiled. No, I said. She'll know. The next few weeks passed gently. I went to class. I learned to paint light reflecting off water. I met another woman named Joyce who invited me to her book club. I said yes. We didn't talk about motherhood, or regret, or second chances. We talked about soup recipes, dogs that don't listen, and how to tell when tulips are truly in bloom. It was the kind of life I used to think belonged to other people. It turns out, it was mine all along. One morning, my phone buzzed. No name, just a photo. The scarf, draped gently across a wooden chair in the gallery office. And next to it, a teacup, not untouched, not full, just warm. No caption, no reply needed. I stared at it for a long time, then saved it to a folder on my phone labeled "Still Here." Sometimes, I still catch myself whispering apologies into the dark. But now, they don't sound like desperation. They sound like lullabies. For the woman I used to be. For the girl I once held in my arms. For the daughter I still love. Even if only from the sidewalk. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about choosing to remember without demand. To leave space. To send warmth, even when no one asks for it. And maybe, just maybe. To let love arrive without ringing the doorbell. Justice can be quiet, but it is never weak. You are not alone. Share your story below. I used to think healing meant being forgiven. That I had to earn my way back. That motherhood was a seat I'd lost forever. But healing, real healing, starts when you stop performing pain just to be allowed back in. It begins the moment you let love exist without proof, without punishment, without expecting it to look like the past. Camila doesn't call me Mom. And maybe she never will. But that postcard, that scarf on a wooden chair, that one shared cup of tea, they told me something louder than any word could. She saw me, I saw her. And sometimes, that is enough to rewrite a life. If you've ever stood outside the life you once dreamed of, wondering if you're allowed to knock again, this story is for you. If you've ever carried guilt like it was a currency, as if suffering made you worthy, this story is for you. And if you've ever let go, not because you stopped loving, but because you finally started living, then maybe you've already begun your own quiet justice.